Wyoming Territory, May 1883, the stagecoach rocked to a stop in the dusty main street of Meadow Run, the horses snorting steam into the morning chill. Zadie Whitlow blinked against the sun as she stepped down, one gloved hand gripping her satchel, the other clutching her wedding dress in its muslin bundle. Her boots touched the dirt like she was stepping into a dream she had rehearsed 100 times, but the groom was not there. She looked around. No one waiting with a flower in hand. No man in a pressed coat and nervous smile. Just a few townspeople going about their business and a dog sleeping under the hitching post. Zadie's heart thudded. She waited. She asked. "Trenton Maddox?" she inquired at the depot, at the saloon, even at the blacksmith's. The same answer followed. "Ain't seen him in near 2 months. Thought he pulled up stakes." Her knees gave slightly, but she straightened herself before anyone could see the tremble. She had left everything behind in Missouri. Her father's farm, her mother's locket buried in the hearth, all to marry a man who had sent her letters full of promises and pressed wildflowers, and now he was just gone. "You all right, miss?" The voice came from just behind her. A tall man stood, hat in hand, coat dusty at the cuffs, eyes the color of storm-washed slate. He looked to be in his late 20s, lean, sun-browned, with a quiet steadiness about him. "I am not," she said, her voice tight but steady. "I came to marry a man who no longer lives here." He nodded once. "That's a hard thing." Zadie turned to move past him, but her knees buckled beneath her. She went down hard, her satchel slipping from her hand. The cowboy was kneeling beside her before she could even catch her breath. "I've got you," he said, voice low and sure. He steadied her with hands that were gentle despite their strength. "Let me help you." "I do not need," she started, but her vision blurred. "You need a place to sit and clean water to drink," he said. "Name's Kade Ellison." "Come on now." He stood and offered his hand. She hesitated, then placed her fingers in his. His grip was warm and solid. Kade walked her to his horse and helped her mount. He led her down a dirt road beyond town, past a field of flax just starting to bloom, until they reached a small homestead tucked into a draw between 2 hills. A corral, a barn, and a modest house with smoke curling from the chimney. He helped her down and opened the door. "You live here alone?" she asked. "I do now," he said, setting a kettle on the stove. "Wife passed 3 years back, just me and the land." Zadie sat stiffly at the table, unsure what to do with her hands. "You did not have to bring me here." "I know," he said, pouring her a glass of water. "But you looked like you needed someone to stand still long enough to catch your breath." Zadie said nothing for a moment, then sipped the water. It tasted of tin and kindness. "I do not know what to do," she admitted at last, barely above a whisper. "I have nothing left." Kade leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "Well, this land needs 2 more hands than I have," he said slowly, "and it's a long summer ahead. I could offer you honest work, a roof, a place to get your footing." She looked up at him. "You are offering me a job," he shrugged. "Offering you a hand and a home if you want it." Zadie blinked. "That is more kindness than I expected today." He smiled, not wide but real. "Most folks out here know what it means to be left behind." She stayed. That night, she lay in the small room at the back of the house, her wedding dress still folded in the muslin, untouched. She watched the moonlight trace the ceiling, listening to the quiet creak of the house and the soft sound of Kade's boots as he stoked the stove once before bed. In the morning, she rose early, found a broom and swept the porch, fed the chickens. Kade showed her how to milk the cow, how to mend the fence, how to spot signs of a sick calf. He did not hover or explain too much, just showed her, then let her do. She liked that. Days passed. Then a week. Then 2. Zadie stood straighter. Her hands grew calloused, her eyes clearer. At night they would sit on the porch, the sky bruised with stars, and talk not about the past but about what they saw in front of them. The ridgeline, the wheat, the way the wind bent the grass like it was listening. She never asked about his wife. He never asked about the letters. One evening, Kade returned from town with a small package wrapped in brown paper. He set it on the table before her without a word. Inside was fabric blue cotton with tiny white flowers. Zadie brushed her fingers over it. "What is this?" "You need a dress that is yours," he said, not meeting her eyes. She swallowed. "Thank you." He nodded once and stepped outside. Later that week, she found him in the barn hammering a loose board. "Kade," he looked up. "I have been thinking," she said. "You offered me a hand, a home, and I have taken both." "You have," he said quietly. "I think I could offer you something in return." He straightened. "Zadie, I am not the woman I was when I stepped off that stage. I do not want to go back." Her voice wavered, but she held his gaze. "I want to stay. If you want that too." For a long moment he said nothing, just looked at her like he was making sure the world had not tilted. Then he stepped toward her, slow and sure. He reached out and took her hand. "I want that more than I can say," he said. She smiled, wide and real. "Then we will build something new." And they did. By early June, the cottonwoods along the creek had leafed out thick and green, their branches swaying in the slow wind. Zadie stood at the edge of the pasture, a length of rope looped around her shoulder, watching the young steer Kade had asked her to help halter. Her skirt was tucked into her boots, and her hair had slipped loose from its knot, strands sticking to the sweat on her neck. She didn't mind. Her hands were steady now. Kade leaned on the fence nearby, arms folded. "If you walk at him straight, he'll bolt. Come in from the side, easy." "I'm not trying to frighten him," she said, glancing back. "You're not. But he don't know that." She took 2 slow steps, then another, keeping her gaze just off the animal's eye line. The steer flicked one ear but didn't move. She brought the rope up, looped it careful under his jaw, then over the ears, just like Kade showed her last week. When the halter was set, she looked back at him. He gave a nod, not smiling, just tipping his chin in approval. She felt the pride bloom in her chest like a coal catching. Later they sat beneath the porch's overhang, a tin plate between them with the last of the cornbread she'd baked that morning. A thunderhead had begun to gather behind the hills to the west. The air was thick with the smell of ozone and clover. "You were right about that steer," she said, breaking off a piece of crust. "He's young," Kade replied, "but not mean. Just needs a hand that don't rush him." Zadie looked out toward the field. "That's a hard kind of patience, letting something come to you on its own." Kade didn't answer at first. She turned to him and saw he was watching the horizon, the wind catching the edge of his collar. "You ever think about leaving?" she asked, his brow furrowed. "Leaving where? This place, the land, starting over somewhere new?" He shook his head once. "I buried too much here." Zadie's voice softened. "I won't ask you about her. I know." He picked up a twig from the porch floor and rolled it between his fingers. "She was kind, that's all you need to know." Zadie nodded, quiet. He looked over at her then. "You ever think of going back east?" "I don't think I'd fit anymore," she said. "I used to dream about parlors and gas lamps and gloves without holes. But I'd rather have dirt under my nails than be beholden to someone else's table." He gave a small sound of agreement. "You've taken to this life faster than most. You gave me room to." They sat in silence for a stretch, the kind that didn't press or pull. The wind shifted, cooler now, and the first drops of rain pattered against the roof. Kade stood. "Storm's coming in quick. We should bring the wagon under the lean-to." She followed him out into the yard. The sky had turned a bruised shade of gray, and lightning flashed in the distant hills. Together they guided the wagon alongside the barn, the wooden wheels crunching over gravel. When they finished, the rain had begun in earnest. As they ducked inside the barn, Zadie brushed water from her sleeves. Her eyes adjusted to the dim light, and she noticed the far wall had a row of shelves, each holding little things carefully placed: a rusted horseshoe, a scrap of ribbon, a child's carved whistle. She stepped closer. "Yours?" He hesitated, then nodded. "They look like pieces of memory." "They are." She turned one of the items in her hand, a tiny ceramic bird with one wing chipped. "You keep them where you can see them." "I don't like forgetting," he said. "Even the hard parts." Zadie looked over at him, her voice low. "I don't either. But some things I wish I could leave behind." Kade leaned against the stall post, rain drumming hard on the roof now. "Then maybe the point isn't forgetting. Maybe it's finding someone who sees it all and stays anyway." She met his eyes. The light between them shifted, not sudden but certain. They didn't speak again until the rain slowed. When it did, they stepped out into the clearing air, the world washed bright and clean. That night, as she folded laundry by lamplight, he came in from the porch, his hat damp in his hand. "I've been thinking," he said. She looked up. "If you're willing, I'd like to build you a room off the west side, not just for sleeping, for your things, your own space." She paused, her fingers still on the hem of his shirt. "That's no small job, I know, but I'd like to do it." Zadie didn't answer right away. Then she stood and crossed the room until she was near enough to see the faint freckle on his cheek, the one shaped like a comma beneath his eye. "I'd like that," she said. He nodded once, and the quiet between them felt different than any they'd shared before. Not absence, but promise. Outside, the moon rose over the wet fields, and the world held its breath. By late July, the ground baked hard beneath the sun, and the air held a dry shimmer that bent the horizon. Zadie stood knee-deep in the vegetable rows, pulling weeds from between the squash vines, her bonnet shading her eyes. The soil crumbled like ash between her fingers. She'd learned to tell when the plants needed water before they drooped just from the way the leaves curled under. From the barn, Kade called out, "You seen the draw knife?" She brushed her palms on her apron and walked over. "You left it on the fence rail yesterday when we trimmed that post." He followed her glance and gave a low breath of relief. "Right. I'll never hear the end of it from Ransom if I lose another tool. He still hasn't let me forget that hammer I dropped in the creek last spring." She tilted her head. "Ransom, neighbor to the east, comes by sometimes to trade salt pork or sharpen blades. He sounds particular and loud. You dislike him." "I doubt that," she said, giving him a glance. "I've learned to make room for difficult men." He leaned against the barn door and watched her a moment, more thoughtful than amused. "You've been working past what's fair, Zadie. I can take more of it on." "I don't want to be kept," she said. "I want to be counted." "You are." He stepped aside to let her pass back toward the house. Every day. Inside, the air was still and hot. She opened the windows to let the breeze carry through. The new room Kade had built off the west side stood framed and roofed now, though the walls inside were still bare. She stood in the doorway, fingertips brushing the edge of the wooden beam he'd sanded smooth by hand. He came in behind her, wiping his palms on a rag. "I'll start on the floorboards tomorrow. Might ask you to help with the finish work if you want." "I'd like that." He watched her a moment longer, then said, "There's a box under the bed. Has some things I kept back from before. I don't look often, but I reckon you ought to know it's there." She turned to face him. "Do you want me to look?" "No, only that I won't hide it," she nodded, understanding passing between them like something spoken aloud. That evening, a dust storm rolled in from the west, sweeping low across the plains with a wall of grit and wind that turned the sky to copper. Kade and Zadie tied shutters closed and brought the milk cow into the barn. The chickens huddled in the corner of the coop, feathers ruffled and eyes wide. Inside, with the lamps lit and the wind howling against the walls, Zadie sat at the table mending one of Kade's shirts. He poured water from the jug into a tin cup and set it beside her. "You always keep your hands moving," he said. "I used to believe quiet meant danger. That if I sat still too long, someone would come along and tell me I didn't belong." Kade pulled a chair close but didn't sit. "They'd be wrong." She didn't answer, just tied off the last stitch and folded the shirt neatly. "I was 16 when I left home," she said after a while. "My father had no use for a daughter who read more than she sewed. I spent 2 years with cousins in Carthage. It wasn't better." Kade sat then, arms resting on his knees. "You never said." "I never had reason to." She looked up at him. "But I don't mind you knowing." The wind slowed sometime after midnight. When they stepped outside the next morning, a fine grit coated everything: the porch rail, the inside lip of the water barrel, even the backs of their necks. Zadie washed her face at the pump while Kade checked the damage to the fence line. By noon, they had the top rail reset and the henhouse repaired. When the work was done, Zadie paused by the edge of the corral and looked out toward the hills. "I never thought I could belong anywhere that didn't already expect me." Kade leaned beside her, arms crossed. "You belong here without needing to prove it." She turned to him, eyes steady. "Then I'd like to stay for good." He didn't speak right away. He looked at her the way a man watches the first blue after a storm, quiet, sure, and without question. "When I built this place, I didn't think anyone else would want to make a life here," he said. "I'm glad I was wrong." She reached for his hand and he met her halfway. Their fingers laced together, palms dry and work worn. There was no rush in it, no flourish, just a truth laid bare. The prairie stretched out before them, wide and open. Behind them stood the house they'd made into something more than shelter. And ahead, the days waited, not asking who they'd been, only who they would become together. The first frost came early that year, creeping into September before the wheat was fully stored. Zadie stood at the window with a shawl around her shoulders, watching Kade in the yard as he hitched the buckboard. The air held a brittle stillness, and the sky was pale as bone. She stepped into her boots and joined him. "Going to town?" she asked, tying her scarf. "Need to trade for lamp oil and salt," he said, checking the harness strap. "Ransom said the general store just got a shipment in from Cheyenne." "Mind if I come?" He paused, then gave a single nod. "Be glad for the company." They rode side by side, the wagon creaking steady beneath them. The road into Meadow Run wound past dry creeks and cottonwoods shedding their leaves early. Kade kept one hand on the reins, the other resting lightly on his thigh. Zadie watched the way his eyes scanned the horizon without rest, a habit he never seemed aware of. "Did you always plan to stay here?" she asked, voice low over the wind. "No," he said. "I came with my brother. We meant to head on toward Montana, try for land there, but he got fevered the second winter, buried him just past the ridge." Zadie looked down at her gloved hands. "I'm sorry." "Was a long time ago," he answered, "but it made the ground feel different somehow, like I owed it something." The town was quiet when they arrived. A few wagons clustered near the mercantile, and a boy chased a dog down the side alley, laughing hard enough to echo off the walls. Inside the store, the air smelled of gunpowder and molasses. While Kade bartered with the clerk over a spool of iron wire, Zadie wandered the back shelves. Her fingers landed on a slim tin box labeled with a faded script, "Dry Yeast." She turned it over and tucked it under her arm. "I'd like to try baking something different," she said when Kade joined her. He glanced at the tin, then at her. "We'll need to get some sugar, too." They traded for what they could carry and walked the wagon around the livery, where Kade stopped to speak with a man repairing a saddle. Zadie waited near the edge of the corral, watching the horses shift in the dust. A woman in a gray bonnet approached her, older, with a lined face and sharp eyes. "You're the girl who came for Trenton Maddox." the woman said, not unkindly. I was, Zadie said, keeping her voice even. The woman nodded once. You're better off. That boy never held to anything longer than a season. Zadie didn't answer. You're with Kade Ellison now, I am. The woman studied her. He's quiet, but he stands by his word. Don't let his silences fool you. I don't, Zadie said. Back on the wagon, Kade didn't ask what the woman said. He handed Zadie a folded paper from the post office. It's from your cousin in Carthage, he said. Arrived last week with the freight. She opened it slowly. The ink was smeared in places, but the writing was familiar. Her cousin had married in June, expected a child by spring. She's well, Zadie said, folding the letter again. Better than I remember her. You miss them? No, she said, but I'm glad they're safe. The ride home was quieter. The sun dipped low, brushing the ridges in gold. Kade pulled the wagon to a stop halfway up the hill and pointed toward the field. See that? Zadie followed his gaze. A coyote, lean and pale, moved low through the grass, ears pricked. He's been circling lately, Kade said. Too close to the coop. Might have to set a trap. Zadie watched the animal disappear into the folds of shadow. He looks hungry. We all are, Kade said, back at the house. She unpacked the sugar and yeast, set the kettle to warm, and mixed a bit of dough with care. Her apron was dusted white by the time Kade came in with kindling. What are you planning? He asked, setting the wood in the bin. Cinnamon bread, she said. If it rises. He leaned against the doorframe. I've never had it. Then you'll have to trust me. Later, with the fire burning low and the smell of warm sugar rising through the kitchen, Zadie stood at the hearth, watching the loaf brown. Kade came to stand beside her, his shoulder brushing hers. I've been thinking, he said carefully, about what you said, about staying for good. She turned her head. And? I've built most of this place with my hands, barn, fences, roof, but it didn't feel finished until you stood in it. The fire snapped soft behind them. Zadie reached out and touched his hand, her thumb resting over the line of his knuckle. I don't need a ceremony to know what we are, she said. I know, he answered, but I'd like to give you one anyway. She didn't speak, just looked at him, eyes steady. He touched her cheek, rough fingers brushing the edge of her hair. There's a preacher who rides through from Rawlins once a month. He'll be here next week. I have a dress, she said, voice barely above a whisper. I know. And then he kissed her, not hurried, not uncertain. Just a quiet promise, sealed in the hush of a room lit by firelight and the scent of bread rising between them. The preacher arrived on a Thursday morning beneath a sky the color of old linen. His horse carried the dust of 2 counties, and his long coat flapped in the breeze when he dismounted. Kade met him at the gate with a firm handshake and led him toward the house while Zadie finished setting out the bread she'd risen overnight. She wore a dress she'd sewn from the blue cotton he'd once brought her, the hem resting just above her boots, her hair pinned with care. The preacher washed his hands at the pump, accepted a plate of cornbread without much ceremony, and asked only once, "You both sure of this?" "We are," Kade said. Zadie nodded, her voice steady. "We've made our choice." They stood just outside the barn doors, beneath the cottonwood that shaded the east side of the house. The land stretched quiet around them, the fields resting between harvests, the air cool with the early scent of winter. Kade took Zadie's hand. The preacher spoke plain, his words brief and without flourish. When it was done, the preacher tipped his hat and said, "A good match made stronger by work and weather." That's the kind that lasts. Zadie and Kade shared a glance, and something unspoken passed between them, more than affection, more than relief. A quiet certainty. He touched her cheek with the back of his hand, and she leaned into it, the gesture as natural as breath. They saw the preacher off with a sack of potatoes and a jar of plum preserves. As his horse faded into the horizon, Zadie and Kade walked back to the house in silence, their shoulders brushing. Inside, the table had been set with care: 2 plates, a jar of wild honey, and a stew that had simmered on the stove since dawn. They sat across from each other, the late light falling through the window in long bands. "You didn't write your brother's name on the barn wall," Zadie said softly. Kade looked up. "No." "Would you want to?" He considered this. "Maybe, when I'm ready for it to be known," she nodded. "I'd stand with you when you do." After the meal, Kade brought out a cedar box she hadn't seen before. Inside were a few folded papers, a pressed rose, and a strip of cloth embroidered with initials not her own. "I kept it because it mattered," he said, placing the box on the table between them. "But it's time I put it away." He carried it to the back room, the one he'd built for her, and slid it onto the top shelf of the cupboard he'd made by hand. Not hidden, not forgotten, just rested. That night they lay down in the same bed for the first time, the oil lamp turned low. She curled into the shape of his body, her palm resting over his heart. The wind outside had calmed, and the night air smelled of pine smoke and dry grass. "You don't have to say anything," she said into the quiet. "I know," he whispered, pressing his lips to her temple. "But I want to." She looked up at him, waiting. "I've known loss, but I never expected a second beginning," he said. "I didn't think it was something a man got." "You didn't find it," she said. "You built it." He pulled her closer, their legs tangled beneath the quilt. Neither of them spoke again, but the silence between them held weight and warmth, not distance. The winter came hard that year, with snow that rose past the porch rail and wind that howled through the eaves. But their home held strong, and their days settled into rhythm. Kade repaired the sled runners while Zadie learned to knit by the fire. They read aloud from the single book. They owned a worn collection of poems left by Kade's mother and traded stories when the kerosene ran low. In February, she told him she was carrying. He didn't speak at first, just pulled her into his arms, his breath caught in his throat. Then he said her name with such reverence it felt like a prayer. They planned the cradle together, sketching it on scrap wood with charcoal. He carved the legs while she stitched a quilt from old shirts. The child came in early autumn, a girl with Kade's eyes and Zadie's mouth, born in the back room with the windows open to the sound of crickets. They named her Clara after no one, so she could belong only to herself. By the next harvest, Zadie walked the rows with Clara nestled against her chest, pointing out the names of herbs and the sound the wind made when it passed through wheat. Kade taught her to hold reins, to listen for the shift in a horse's breath. Their days were simple, not easy. But every task felt like a stone laid in something lasting. They never left the land. It grew around them and they grew into it. The porch posts needed replacing, the roof patching every few years. But the house stood. The love stood. And every evening, when the sun dipped low behind the ridge, Kade would find Zadie wherever she was, kneeling in the garden, sweeping the porch, rocking Clara to sleep, and he'd reach for her hand like it was the first time, and she'd meet him there always. They lived long. They lived true. And they were never parted.